Good evening, everyone. Hi, great to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and we're having a prompt start right on 7 p.m. And I'd also like to just let people know to turn their phones off if they haven't done so already. As most of you know, I'm Debbie Lee, Festival Director of Melbourne Jewish Book Week. I'd first like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I honour their culture of keeping story alive for over 65,000 years, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. For the last 3 years, Melbourne Jewish Book Week has been partnering with the Jewish Quarterly to interview essayists on a huge variety of topics reflecting Jewish knowledge, history, philosophy, politics and culture. We have such a rich tradition in the arts. It seems almost ironic that the book is now, in many ways, undermining our history. Words like genocide are being bandied about and, worse still, being turned on us as a people. And meanwhile, aspects of our worst tragedy in modern times, the Holocaust, are being fetishised and misrepresented for commercial gain. Tonight's discussion focuses on the latest Jewish Quarterly essay, Shameless, Exploiting the Holocaust, and its author, Tanya Gold, is with us live on Zoom. Tanya is an award-winning British journalist who writes for Harper's Magazine, The Spectator, The Jewish Chronicle, and The New York Times. Interviewing Tanya tonight is Daniel Haumschild. Hailing from the US, Daniel is both an academic and a museum director, curator, and educator, specialising in Holocaust and genocide studies. Daniel joined the Melbourne Holocaust Museum in June this year as manager of exhibitions and storytelling. With huge thanks to the Melbourne Holocaust Museum for hosting this event tonight, we couldn't think of a more fitting venue. I will also just mention that Noah is here from the Jewish Quarterly, and she will be selling the books over there after the conversation. And finally, I'd like to now hand over to Daniel and Tanya. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Debbie. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being with us tonight. And hello, Tanya. How are you?
Hi, Dan. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. We are really excited to talk to you about your essay, Shameless, Exploiting the Holocaust. What I think we're going to do tonight is just try to break the essay down a little bit for the audience here who has not yet had a chance to read it. I encourage you all to do so. Please purchase a copy over there after this event. For those who have, maybe we can just shed a little bit of light on what you've said in the article and just get a little bit deeper into the conversation. Before we begin, I actually kind of want to ask you a little bit about the way that this article came to you. What were you inspired to do? What inspired you to write this? I know you wrote something in Harper's in, I believe it was last year, called My Auschwitz Vacation. And maybe you can explain a little bit about that story that kind of brought this to your attention.
Well, I was one of those people who didn't go to Poland until quite late in life, like many people in the audience. My family were Polish Jews going back. My grandmother was from Łódź, and on the other side of the family, they were bakers in Warsaw. And thankfully, they came over quite early. So I was one of those people who could never go to Poland, could never look at it, could never touch it. And then, of course, anti-Semitism began to rise about 15 years ago in the UK. We began to bloom into life. And so I asked Harper's Magazine if I could go to Poland because I was very, very interested in the way that the Poles negotiated with the Holocaust. So I went to Kazimierz, which is, as many of you will know, the Jewish quarter of Krakow, where Schindler's List was shot. And I found what I described as a haunted Jewish Disneyland. It was a Jewish world without Jews. It was like a theme park. And then I went to Auschwitz-Birkenau and was absolutely horrified to discover that there have been these battles and academics will know this, but for many years over memorialization at Auschwitz, it's being pulled this way and that way, and it's become this sort of universal symbol that has very little to do with Jews, and there is a lot of erasure of the Jews there. There is no Jewish symbolism, for example, on any of the public monuments at Auschwitz-Birkenau, which absolutely horrified me. And I also spent quite a lot of time in Oswiecim, the town next door, which was fascinating. Another place where there were once Jews and no longer are, and there's this sort of empty, hollow memorialization. And then, as anti-Semitism continued to rise, I realized that this absence of the Jew from Holocaust culture, I mean, memorialization in Poland, wasn't unique to the museums and the sites. It is also percolated and is actually stampeding through popular culture about the Holocaust. And I read some books also. I'll come to the end of my answer in a minute. And I read some genuinely offensive books while I was researching this article. One of which is The Boy in the Striped Pajamas by the Irish writer John Boyne. And I know we'll go into this later. And I was so shocked that school children are reading this novel and their teachers are saying this is education about the Holocaust. I thought I had to go through all the popular culture, or as much of it as I could find, and talk about what has happened to the representation of the Jew in popular culture and how it impacts on modern anti-Semitism.
Yeah, thank you so much for that background and that story about what did you call it? A haunted Disneyland of
haunted Jewish Disneyland of Krakow.
Yeah, haunted Jewish Disneyland of Krakow.
It's so strange, Dan. If none of you have gone to Poland, and it's entirely a personal experience, you would see British tourists wandering around because it's sold as a cheap tourist destination. And they would wander around, and this British woman said to me, I had no idea it would be so sad. And anyway, that's an aside.
Well, but I think it's exactly to the point of your essay, your book, which addresses this thing that you call in the book Shoah culture. And it seems that Shoah culture is a potentially broad term. In the book, you talk a lot about some of the negative elements of Shoah culture, or in some ways, an absence of the Shoah within what is called or what is described as Shoah culture in a more popular sense. And I'm wondering if you could define this term Shoah culture for us and give us a little bit more insight into what that means to you.
I mean, I had to call it Shoah culture in the essay for brevity. I tried out a few lines along the lines of, Shoah culture that thinks it's Shoah culture but isn't really Shoah culture. So really, what I define as Shoah culture is artworks that are really about the Holocaust, and they face it head on, and they are never offensive, and they memorialize and they shed light. And there are very, very few of them. I said in the essay, I think it's negligible among the popular works. And I have to say from the off, there is a body of Yiddish and Israeli work that I did not touch for this essay because I was focusing on popular culture. Things that people have heard of, non-Jewish people have heard of, things that you might potentially be able to see on release at a cinema. And of that, there is very, very little. I did include some things that I consider to be absolutely superb, and I'll run through those very quickly. Claude Lanzmann's masterpiece, 9.5-hour documentary Shoah, 1985, the non-parallel for me. And I think we're going to talk later, Dan, about why it's so good. The memorialists Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi, people have heard of them. And also Tadeusz Borowski, the Polish memoirist, and above all, really Zalman Gradowski, the Sonderkommando memoirist who died in the Sonderkommando uprising, and before that, he buried his testimony. He is hardly read at all. So my personal definition, and a handful of films that I think are, well, the word is moral. The Pawnbroker, starring Rod Steiger, Sidney Lou May's film about a survivor, that's quite old now. I thought Son of Saul, which is based on Zalman Gradowski's memoirs, was very good. But there's very, very little. But what there is alongside that, and I had to call it showa culture, but all the way through, I'm making the point that isn't showa culture at all, is this absolute sort of mass of rubbish, which began with some quite intellectual works, which, though on the other hand, I will argue were very, very immoral, poorly thought out, and offensive. And now we just have this pile of, I think, what I described yesterday as crime fiction. You know, you can pick up a dozen books in your local bookstore that think they're about the Holocaust, but are just pulp crime fiction and are actively misleading.
Thank you for that definition. I appreciate it, and I appreciate where you're coming from as well, as somebody who has worked in Holocaust in spaces that are trying to represent the Holocaust in a way that is meaningful and profound and truthful, and to then be barraged constantly with content that is far from that. Some of the negative elements of what we might call this fake showa culture that you identify in your book, and I'd just like to list them and then maybe break them down a little bit with you if you don't mind. One is that they provide essentially misunderstandings of the Holocaust, which is to say that they tell kind of lies about the Holocaust. Another is that they create misunderstandings and misrepresentations of Jews, and or just eliminate Jews entirely from the story of the Holocaust. And then thirdly, that these provide essentially missed opportunities for self-reflection and self-understanding, which then ultimately these problems contribute to an inability to reckon with anti-Semitism. So if an understanding of the Holocaust is supposed to help us combat anti-Semitism, these three problems in particular, not really understanding the Holocaust, not really representing Jews, and then not really providing a mirror that allows us to be self-critical, actually do the opposite. They don't help us toward resolving the problem of anti-Semitism. Is that a fair depiction of what you were writing about within this essay, or have I gotten
Yes.
it? Please correct me if I'm.
No, that's exactly what I think. And I think, as all students of anti-Semitism know, there was a huge element of fictionalization of Jews in Europe throughout our history. Howard Jacobson, the great British novelist and comic novelist, said to me shortly after October the 8th, October the 7th, I feel like I'm a fictional being. And we all understand this. Vasily Grossman, whatever you accuse the Jew of is what you're guilty of. Or was it Sartre? I sort of mangled them. But there's this idea that Jews are the fictional beings in the ghettos, at the edges of the town. They're the Christ killers. They're the well poisoners. They're mysterious people. And I would argue that as soon as the Holocaust, which, as we all know, was not just the work of the Nazis in particular, in general, and Adolf Hitler in particular. It was a cumulative European project. There were collaborators in every single country where Jews were butchered. In some countries, they didn't even wait for the Nazis to take power. And I would say that as soon as the Holocaust ended and the memorialization or cultures grappling with it began, we began to see exactly the same thing. The fictionalization of the Jew began again. And I don't know how much you want to talk about Anne Frank, but it began very, very early with her. And even Primo Levi, who published very, very early. He published If This Is a Man, I think in 1947. Though don't hold me to that. He de-Judaized his work. He took out references to his Judaism because already he knew that and who is smarter than Primo Levi? Already he knew that if he didn't make it palatable and that terrible world that terrible relatable. I mean, this is the contradiction. What happened to the Jews was singular, I would say, of course, with the exception of the Romans and the Sinti. How do you make something like that relatable for a wide audience? Well, and the answer is, of course, you can't really. So Primo Levi did that. And also, many of you will know that Elie Wiesel's Night, which is 140 pages, very crisp, a lot of Christian imagery, began as a 900-page raging Yiddish work. So I think these brilliant writers already knew. And Otto Frank knew too. You know, Anne's father, who organized the publication of her diary, um, you know, it was de-Judaized. The German translation, rude references towards Germans were taken out. You know, Anne shouting at all Germans that she hated them or was softened. It was soothed away. The best-selling play, I think it was 1955, of Anne Frank's diary. The show is already becoming a universal touch point of which it can happen to anyone. We're all the victims. You know, it's already happening very, very early. And then it gets worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And you picked up on the second point, which is that this misrepresentation of Jewish life, of Jewish truth, of Jewish culture, of Jewish identity, and just essentially even the presence of the Jew in the story of the Holocaust as a foundational element of this this negative side of Shoah culture, as we're talking about. And as you were writing, in your writing, and in my reading of your writing, I kept thinking of this work by Imre Kertész, the Nobel Prize-winning Hungarian author who wrote a number of amazing works. I recommend basically all of them. He also wrote this essay called "Who Owns Auschwitz?" Which is about Holocaust kitsch and misrepresentations of the Holocaust. And there's this line that I want to read to you, and just to see what you think about it, because I think it resonates with everything that you've just said. And then maybe we can dig down into like the Christianization, the kind of absolution figures that are produced in Shoah culture, and also this kind of universalization without specificity. But he says in this text, "Who Owns Auschwitz?" He says, "The authentic witness is or will soon be perceived as being in the way and will have to be shoved aside like the obstacle he is." This is for like the Shoah culture to continue to produce itself. He says, the words of Amari, who I believe you also reference in your essay, prove their truth. Quote, "We, the victims, will appear as the truly incorrigible, irreconcilable ones, as the anti-historical reactionaries in the exact sense of the word. And in the end, it will seem like a technical mishap that some of us still survived." That's the quote. What do you hear of your work? And
sorry. Finish your question. I'm sorry, Dan.
I was just going to ask what you hear of your work in that quote that I just read to you.
Well, I think about my passages on Schindler's List, sort of Schindler's Ark, which became Schindler's List, and Sophie's Choice by William Styron, which is a repulsive piece of work. And I just think that the Holocaust is, in the popular culture, it is not about Jews. It is not about Jews anymore. Very quickly, it became a story about Gentiles. And I think that happened for a lot of reasons. And this has continued, and it's led to a place where, towards the end of my research, I read a book called The Death's Head Chess Club by a man called John Donohoe. And I mean, don't bother looking for it and don't bother reading it because it's trash. But in it, he tells the story of a chess player, a Jewish chess player, whose life is saved by an SS officer in Auschwitz. And at the end of this stupid book and its ridiculous plot, Emil, the Jew, goes to Auschwitz-Birkenau and he says Kaddish. He says Kaddish for the SS officer and for all of them. That's in quotes, and for all of them. So
yeah, you mentioned in your book this this requirement of within the type of literature and the type of representation that you're talking about, this requirement of the Jew to be a figure of absolution for the perpetrator, right? That there's this moment in The Boy in the Striped Pajamas where the Jewish victim says, "It's okay, I don't feel it anymore," essentially, right? Like, it's like what you're doing is actually not that bad, not that hurtful. I don't really feel it anymore. It's fine, right? And so there's this constant requirement, as you say, even in that example, of seemingly the Jewish victim to not only kind of not be the victim, but then also to say to the perpetrator, "It's okay." And so then the entire narrative of perpetration and victimization kind of gets flipped on its head. Is that?
yeah, and this goes through all the culture. I mean, you'll remember from Schindler's List, the banner across the screen, "He who saves one life saves the world entire," which, 90% of Polish Jewry died in the Shoah. And that's on the screen because it's consoling, right? It's on the screen because it's consoling. And that's minimization. As regards John Boyne's The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which for people who haven't read it, and you shouldn't read it unless you want to get incredibly angry, which is a book about a fictional child, a fictional commandant of Auschwitz, who makes friends with a Jewish boy, or an apparently Jewish boy. He's the least Jewish child I've ever met. In fiction or elsewhere, and they get gassed together at the end. So there, I've spoilt it for you. And one thing I will say about Boyne's Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which is much read in schools, it sold millions of copies and it's taught in schools, is at least it's got a Jew in it. And he's this extraordinarily passive Jew. Yeah, as you said, he presented far more to me as a Catholic child. But then I argue in the essay that John Boyne hasn't written a book about the Holocaust. He's written a book about himself, and he's inserted it into the Holocaust. And the better writers, the more skilled writers, because there are two kinds of writers who write Holocaust fiction. There are good writers and there are bad writers. And John Boyne, unfortunately, is a good writer. And he inserts himself into his novel. For reasons of vanity and personal trauma. But all writers do this. All writers write about themselves. You have to be a very skilled writer like Martin Amis with a lot of self-awareness, to not do this. And Boyne's Jewish character is, I mean, he writes about Jews as if he's never met one. And as you say, Shmuel gets beaten because of something Bruno, which is the commandant of Auschwitz's son, says, and he says, "Oh, don't worry, I don't feel it anymore." And if you contrast this with the testimony of the boys of the Warsaw Ghetto, I mean, also when I went to Poland, I went to the museum in Warsaw where you can read the testimony and you can read it for yourselves, and it's like they're shouting at you. You can hear their fury, you can hear their rage, you can hear their passion as their families are butchered around them. Exactly the same thing happened to Boyne's so-called Jewish character Shmuel. No rage, passivity, acceptance, love even. What are we hearing here? We're hearing from the world's greatest fictionalized Jew, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and you talk about the Christianization of Holocaust literature as well, right? You mentioned Schindler before, and you see him sometimes as a Christian figure. You also talk about Anne Frank as essentially a Christianized version of the true Anne Frank, right? I'm wondering if you can talk about that. How has I suppose it could be what we might call like de-Judaification of it, but you also say it's actually a Christianization of these works. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I'm just making a note to myself so I stay on target. I mean, I think we've really got to differentiate between Schindler's Ark, the novel by Thomas Keneally, and Schindler's List, the film by Steven Spielberg. And I would argue that the novel by the non-Jewish Australian novelist was actually a truer and better work about the Holocaust than Schindler's List. I think Schindler's List, and it wasn't Spielberg's fault, but I think Schindler's List did a lot of damage. So if I could go into that quickly, the thing about Schindler's Ark, and we see this very early, is you're moving away from a story about Jews. It is not a story about a Jew. It is a story about a non-Jewish rescuer, as everybody knows. And that was quite deliberate. The story was told to Keneally by one of the men Schindler saved. His name was Poldek Pfefferberg. He ran a handbag shop in Los Angeles. Thomas Keneally walked in looking to buy a briefcase, and Pfefferberg just got him, and that was that. And that was always Pfefferberg's intent, to tell the story of the man who had saved him. And he wrote quite a complicated book. There are a lot of Jewish characters in it, and they tell their stories. And this is erased from the film, which I think is much more, does have much more of the Christian imagery in it. Schindler, in both book and film, he is a savior. He is I think Keneally called him a dancing, he had a dancing on the lip of hell exuberance. He was a lapsed Catholic, like Keneally. So it's a Catholic writing about a Catholic, um, with Jews. So I don't think that Keneally could really help, but make it a story, about a Gentile, and how a Gentile retains his humanity, and his soul, or regains it rather, because Schindler did work for the Nazis. He worked for German military intelligence, and his idea that he couldn't bear that this was repulsive, and he was going to save these Jews, did steal upon him. I mean, it's an amazing story, but it's a story of rescue. It's not a story about the Holocaust. I always give Claude Lanzmann, maker of Shoah Primacy, in these matters. He made the greatest work of art, really the essential work of art. And he always said the Shoah is not about life, it's about death. And Schindler's List is a story about life. And Keneally said it himself. The Shoah happened at the margins of the list, the gulf around the margins of the list. That is where the Holocaust is. And he didn't write about the gulf. He wrote about the list. So there are definitely elements of Christian imagery, and particularly the terrible scene at the end of the film when Liam Neeson as Schindler is in the arms of his accountant, and saying, I could have done more, I should have done more, and seeking absolution that way.
And you
You
also
wanted me to
talk
talk
about.
Sorry.
I just wanted to see because obviously Schindler is this lapsed Catholic person in real life, right? But then there's Anne Frank, who is not a lapsed Catholic person in real life, and yet in your in the depictions of her throughout much of popular culture, there is this kind of Christianization of her life and the meaning that she kind of gives to people within popular culture. And I'm wondering, yeah, because at one point in the book, I think you call her the
Jesus
Christ of the
Christ.
attic, the Jesus Christ of the attic, or something like that. I'm just wondering if you can tell us more about that.
Well, I mean, I think there are two things happening here. The first is what was done to her, and the second is how people read her. Um, and Judaism, as I said, has sort of been stripped away, and she wasn't what people would recognize as very Jewish. Stereotypically, the Franks were irreligious, secular Jews, and I always say to myself, sort of bitterly and with irony, is that if Anne Frank had been a Yiddish-speaking Polish girl, nobody would have bought, nobody would have wanted to buy her diary. So, there's so many representations of Anne Frank in fiction now, and on film, maybe 27 films. And the Judaism is absolutely just pushed to the margins. And this is about a girl who was murdered for being a Jew, and she knew it. Um, as regards, what I call the cult of Anne Frank, um, which is so de-Judaized now, that the Anne Frank House Museum in Amsterdam a few years ago actually tried to ban one of its workers from wearing a kippah openly. And the writer Dara Horn, the Jewish writer, said very brilliantly, in my view, when they changed their minds 6 months later, the Anne Frank House is a bad place to force a Jew into hiding. And then, of course, there was a popular book came out a couple of years ago saying that Anne Frank had been murdered, had been betrayed. The family had been betrayed by another Jew, and the book was withdrawn when serious historians got involved and said, actually, you don't have any evidence for this. But it sort of betrays a yearning. It betrays a yearning, doesn't it? And the reason why people attach themselves to the Anne Frank myth is because it does offer absolution. The Christ figure offers absolution, and quotes of things that she said are pulled out. Most famously, I still believe despite everything that people are good at heart. And Dara Horn again says very brilliantly, and then a few weeks later, she met people who weren't. So I think people like to look at the Anne Frank diary, and they take out what they want to take out, which is there's this irreligious Jewish girl who forgives them. She says, I want to go on, I want to be read after my death. I want to go on living after my death is another line from the diary that people seem to particularly love because, and people can give her what they want. Now, I think the best analysis of Anne Frank is in Cynthia Ozick's marvelous piece from the New Yorker of 1997. I think it's called Who Owns Anne Frank? And Ozick argues that Anne Frank was sort of stolen from herself and turned into this universal metaphor for goodness. But Anne Frank was murdered because she was a Jew, and the cult seems terribly, terribly uninterested in what really happened to her, which is she was deported to Bergen-Belsen. Her hair was cut off. We have this from witnesses. She got typhus. She died in agony and terror. And very much like Schindler's Ark, the Anne Frank diary is an amazing and incredibly valuable piece of testimony. My problem with it is not its existence, far from it. What a writer she was. It's all true. Everything they say about her is true. And Philip Roth raves about her in his marvelous, bitter short novel, The Ghostwriter, that I advise everybody to read, and I'm not going to give away any of its secrets. Um, and she has been used and she has been traduced. My problem with these works of art is their emphasis. You would think no other pieces of work about the Holocaust, exist. They crowd out other, equally valuable or even more valuable things.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and one that you keep coming back to, that a lot of the issue that you take in this book is not with, some of it is with the authors themselves, that's for sure. Others is with the kind of cult that grows up around the authors, right? Whether it's Anne Frank or others, or even the reinterpretation of certain works like Schindler's Ark into Schindler's List, and the way that that sometimes also creates this opportunity for a universalization, like an application to everyone, with that by necessity kind of squashes the singularity or the particularity of the person who's actually writing, right? So even in Anne Frank, I've heard recently somebody was talking to me about, they tried to mention to me the Anne Frank of Brazil was like a phrase that came out of their mouth, and I thought, what does that mean? What does it mean to, and then they said, yeah, well, there's also an Anne Frank of Denmark and an Anne Frank of, and I thought, what are you talking about? There's Anne Frank, and then there's other people, and it's that desire to universalize a story so quickly that you destroy the singularity of that story. You essentially destroy Anne Frank by making her everyone in some ways. All right, I'll move on. One thing that I think is interesting in your work too is that you mentioned mirrors a couple times. You mentioned this word mirrors a couple times, and one of them is a mirror that is written into the book The Zone of Interest, which you distinguish also from the film Zone of Interest.
Yeah.
And the mirror there is a mirror that when you look into it allows you to see your soul, which is the way of saying, and I think for me, good works of literature are opportunities for us to be self-reflective in a way that allows us to see our soul, something inside, something in us that like is called out by this amazing work of literature. But then this other kind of mirror that you mentioned at the beginning of the essay, you say Shoah culture is a mirror that allows us to see what we desire. And I wonder if you can help us distinguish between these two mirrors that are potential within works of Holocaust literature or representation.
Well, I mean, I'll take the first one first, which is, I mean, it's basically the same answer to the question I just gave you. People people watch Schindler's List because at the end of the day, they make you feel good when you come out of it, right? And who ever heard of a Holocaust film? I always say a good piece of work about the Holocaust should be very, very painful to read, very, very painful to watch. You certainly shouldn't come out of it feeling happy. And it's the same with some of the movies about Anne Frank, the original one where Otto says, "She puts me to shame," he says, reading her diary when he returns to the attic, because she has forgive the Germans. Or the implication is that she is full of forgiveness and passivity and love, despite, though actually we have no idea how Anne Frank felt when she got to Bergen-Belsen, because there was no diary. So that's the mirror I'm talking about. People look and they see either Jewish evil, or they see there's a massive amount of literature about the glamour of the perpetrator. So they see their interest in the perpetrator, and the best example of that is Jonathan Littell's very literary and obscene, I think it's 2006 novel, The Kindly Ones. Or they see forgiveness. They see what they want. That's what I mean. As regarding Martin Amis's mirror in the zone of interest, is it okay if I just talk about, Dan, why I think this is the best novel I've read about the Holocaust?
Of course, please.
Because Martin Amis, I suppose, the man looking into the mirror, the mirror at the beginning of the zone of interest is a king asks a magician to make a mirror, and the magician does, and if you look in the mirror for a whole minute, the king will give you treasure, and nobody could look in the mirror for a minute, for a whole minute. And Amos writes that's what National Socialism is. It showed you who you really were, and that's the zone of interest. And I think Amos could look into the mirror. Actually, I think he was the man looking into the mirror. And I think there's this idea grown up around Holocaust fiction, is that it's untouchable. William Styron writing his, obscenely anti-Semitic novel of hatred, inadequacy, and erasure, as I feel like calling it today, Sophie's Choice. Oh God, I lost my thread. What was I going to say? I was getting so angry with William Styron.
But you were talking
William,
about your affection for the zone of interest, and you got into this idea of the kind of untouchability
oh yeah,
of
yeah.
the.
Styron called it unyielding. He said Auschwitz. I've been to Auschwitz, and he was writing about it in the New York Times when he was doing the research he was going. And basically, he was saying, "Oh, it's like Dracula's castle. It's unyielding. I don't understand it. It's unyielding because you are not open to it. The Holocaust is not unyielding. Just listen." You are the one who is unyielding. And Elie Wiesel also said a novel about Treblinka is either not a novel or it's not about Treblinka. And I mean, my own view on that is that Wiesel was just saying, pause, stop, wait, think. And of course, there's the very famous line by Theodor Adorno saying there can be no poem. I'm paraphrasing, after Auschwitz, and he actually retracted that. And I mean, I've never believed this. I've never believed that you can't write good fiction or make good art about the Holocaust. And for me, it will be different for others. The proof is Martin Amis's The Zone of Interest. And if you haven't read it, I beg you to read it alongside the other works I've talked about, because it is a book of incalculable tenderness and intelligence and fury and love. And I don't think anyone has ever written better about Nazism. And he manages to do it with, I mean, it won't be for everyone. I loved the comedy. And the reason why I gave Martin Amis permission, not that it's up to me, to use comedy is he has clearly read everything. It is perfectly obvious that he has read absolutely everything. And so instead of burying the Holocaust as lesser novelists do, or taking it for themselves, or just writing, lies about it, he explains things to me that I did not understand before. And he particularly does this through one of his three major characters, who is the Sonderkommando, Shmuel. And I have no doubt that Amos read all the Sonderkommando memoirs. It's perfectly obvious. And he thanks Primo Levi in the acknowledgements, of course. And Shmuel explained things to me I had not understood before from reading Zalman Grodowski and other Sonderkommando testimony. He explained to me how they could do it. And Shmuel, Amos's character, introduced himself with the line, "We are the saddest men in the history of the world, and of all of them, I am the saddest." And Amos investigates his character, and he tells us who he is, and he tells us how he could bear it. And I believe him. And I feel that this novel acts as a memorial, which all good show a culture must to the world, to the world that is lost. And it is moral, it is noble, it is just. So that I recommend.
There you go, everybody. Zone of interest. Pick it up. I think one thing that you mentioned there that I really picked up on also in your work, in the midst of a lot of what felt like real indignation at what has been produced in the name of the Holocaust, there is also this appreciation and real drive toward, you said the word love in your appreciation for the zone of interest, and a sense of love that allows people to look very clearly at the thing that they're trying to examine, and then more clearly at themselves, right? In this way of the mirror that kind of allows us to see ourselves through examining something very, very honestly and truthfully. That is a way that that's a way that I define love myself. And so to hear you say it, to put it that way, I felt very seen through your work in that regard. But often we're too afraid to hear the truth, as you also write on page 88. And sometimes we create these characters that allow us to really stray far from the truth. And this is the last negative example we'll talk about, I think, before we move on to other forms of love. But I wanted to mention Rodolphe Huss, who appears so many times in various literatures, including in the Zone of Interest, although not named as such in one of the versions of the Zone of Interest. But that character has become a bit of a trope within Holocaust literature when it comes to kind of defining who the Nazis are. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about that character.
Well, I was just when you talked about love, I just made a note to myself. I just want to appall the audience that in Sophie's Choice, at one point, William Styron, who grew up in the southern states of America and was raised as a Christian, has the nerve to tell people, to tell rabbis. I mean, it sounds so mad as I repeat it, but it's there in the book. He tells rabbis that they should read Rudolf Hoss's prison diaries. I mean, why? Um, so sorry, I'm just starting laughing. So Rudolf Hoss is a figure of absolute fascination to the bad Holocaust novelist. He first appears, of course, in Sophie's Choice, and I'm afraid there's a sex scene. And I wrote literary novelists, which is a term I'm using rudely here, can never resist giving themselves a VIP pass. They just can't help it. So instead of writing about the victims, and I do say towards the end of my essay, there is more about Rudolf Hoss in the popular fiction about the Holocaust than there is on the entirety of Polish Jewry. I mean, can you believe that? Martin Amis, of course, does him brilliantly. And then as we move towards the more recent novels, you know, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, The Death Head's Chess Club, The Girl in the Striped Dress, you know, The Violinist of Auschwitz, he's always popping up and he's usually got a headache. And it was Styron again who Hoss has got a migraine when Sophie, who works in his office, of course she does, meets him, and so I really wanted to call this essay Hoss's migraine actually because I thought it was a really brilliant example of how so-called Holocaust fiction or art is it's not about Jews at all. Suddenly we're talking about, you know, the psychopath who's got a headache. Who cares if he's got a headache? I'm glad he's got a headache. But I did just want to say that I'm absolutely certain. I said Martin Amis read everything. Absolutely certain that I bet the house on it that he read Hoss's Prison Diary, which is this, and it's just pathetic. He wrote it in prison before the Poles hanged him, and he has absolutely no awareness of what he did or who he is. And I could hear Amos thinking in the Zone of Interest, this will not do. Is this the mind that sent European Jewry to its ending? I'm going to do this better. I'm going to do it for you because you're not. This is another thing that you can't do. This is another one of your myriad moral failures. But it's yet another example of the obsession with the perpetrator. And we could be generous and say people like to put themselves into the shoes of the perpetrator to wonder whether they too would have colluded with or murdered Jews and Roma and Sinti in the war. But I find this question is something that you need to ask yourself after you have embarked on what I'm horribly going to describe as your journey into learning what happened to the Jews of Europe. You know, you don't start with that from the off. You don't start with, ooh, what does the Holocaust mean for me?
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that you finish the book, if you don't mind, I'm just going to quote you back to yourself because I think it's fantastic, and I'd love to talk to you about it a little bit because I get the sense that if we come back also to the question of anti-Semitism, right, which frames the book, that for a while you were more or less you were uncomfortable with what was happening, but then as anti-Semitism continues to peak and rise and seemingly peak, but then continue to somehow get worse, you felt like you needed to write both the article in Harper's and also this essay because in the end we're trying to address something that's very real in the lives of everybody today in the world, which is to say anti-Semitism. And so you write in the book, you say, in the end, I think people are just too afraid to hear the truth, though this is perhaps a generous interpretation. And this is why anti-Semitism endures. You cannot love Jews if you refuse to understand what happened to them and why, if you write myths about them and call it art. Pretty good, right? So I'd just love to hear you comment on that because what I'm hearing you say in this work and in what we've talked about tonight is that one of the antidotes to anti-Semitism, one of the ways that we can combat anti-Semitism is love, is philo-Semitism, maybe broadly speaking, but really love in a way that you're talking about of actually looking at something truthfully and honestly and addressing something with integrity. I just want to hear your comments about that because I think that's a really powerful message, but I want you to be able to put it in your own words as well.
I'm worried that this is an unanswerable question. You know, the trajectory of the Jews in Europe, the place that Jews have in the collective imagination. You know, I suppose what we're calling, you know, the Christian soul. As regards my generous interpretation, it's easy for me to say, and it's easy for anyone to say, the reason why people don't want to grapple with what the Holocaust was, and you understand this incredibly quickly if you read Grodowski and if you read Borowski, is that Europe was empty of its Jews. They were put on the trains, they went to the ramp, and almost everybody, man, woman, child, into the ovens. And as Grodowski said, in 15 minutes, they would be in a wheelbarrow. You know, that is what happened to the Jews of Europe. And I believe, because I have to believe, because who wants to sit here and go, along with the Jerusalem School and Robert Wistrich's, the historian's interpretation, that it is our job to be victims, to be hated, to be loathed. You know, it's a very difficult thing to believe. And so I tell myself that people are not interested because it's too frightening, because they're too frightened. Because they're too frightened to understand that civilization is a veneer as thin as a spider web. And 1 minute, like the Jews of Jedwabne in Poland, was it in 1940? You know, when half of the town murdered the other half of the town. You know, this is the world we live in. So, you know, I cleave to that, you know, interpretation because I have to, because the alternative is too frightening. You know, as regards anti-Semitism today, you know, other people will have different views. A lot of people, a lot of Jews in Britain believe, particularly young Jews, believe that this the terrible anti-Semitism that we're seeing now is all triggered by the actions of the Israeli government towards the Palestinians. You know, my fear is that it is part of a much longer narrative where the Jew is the Christ killer and the way, you know, and that is not to give a pass. We all have to do our caveats. You know, that is, you know, I make no comment on Israeli foreign policy or military policy, but I fear that the rhetoric that I hear from white Christian Europeans is part of that continuation that led us to all be thrown not us, them, to be thrown into the ovens. And my Freudian slip just there will also indicate that there's a fair bit of generational trauma for all of us going on. And that was a very rambly answer. It was hardly an answer at all.
It's all right, Tanya. I loaded you with a lot, so I appreciate you answering.
I can't see any
well,
love. I can't see any love in this literature. You know, I hear the line in the film Bridget Jones's Diary, "Darling, you look like someone from Auschwitz in that outfit." And I see the beginning of an X-Men Marvel film in which Magneto, the Jewish character who was in Auschwitz, raises it, or is at the end, raises Auschwitz from the mud. You know, and what I see is ennui. You know, what I see is boredom. What I see is I don't see love. You know, I see shut up already.
yeah.
You know, how can we look while not into the mirror?
Sure, yeah, and that's what I mean. The work that you seem to address with love is that work that does look directly at the thing, right? That's the work of Borowski. That's the work of Primo Levi. That's the work of Amis in Zone of Interest, right? These are the works that actually allow us to grow in our, as you say at the end, civility. You say also that Primo Levi was civilized, and his writing is, among other things, an account of the attempt by Nazism to remove his civility, which failed.
I mean,
Right?
Levy's fascinating, isn't he? Sorry,
Yeah.
I'll let you ask the
No, go
question.
ahead. Go ahead.
But Levy is fascinating. I mean, Levy is, oh God, it's a terrible thing to say, isn't it? Who's the best of the Holocaust memoirists? You know, and I do want to say, because I haven't said it before, I'm not saying that you should read Zalman Grodowski, who was the Sonderkommando at Auschwitz, who buried his testimony, because, and this speaks to the point of what is good Holocaust culture. And it should be impossible to read, and it is. It's agony to read. So, you know, please don't read it, because the people who read it are the people who shouldn't be reading it, and the people who should read it won't read it. And it took me 2 weeks to read it, and I wept for him, and I wept for his wife, and so that's the most immediate. But Levy, Primo Levi is called the greatest, and he's extraordinary. But I do wonder, if the reason why non-Jewish people read Primo Levi is because, firstly, he's not that Jewish. You know, he, like Anne Frank, is a secular Jew, and secondly, because he wrote with no anger. You know, all that Levi requires of you is that you should listen. You know, there is. I'm not going to call it a placidity. I'm not even going to call it an acceptance, but I'm just going to say for me, certainly in the earlier works, if this is a man in truce, there's no rage. And so it can be read. And I think that is why people read it, because it doesn't feel accusatory. I mean, it is, but it doesn't feel like it is. You know, and I think people can hear, and I think that you have to put your rage and you have to put your testimony in a certain way, or people will not read it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You said it in that answer, and also at the beginning, a very important and simple thing, which is to listen. Just simply listen, like actually listen. And I think that's a really just an immediate and obvious takeaway from my conversation with you. But I also want to now listen to the audience, because I'm sure that they have some questions for you. And I'll open it up for anybody to ask a question to Tanya. There is somebody with a microphone in here, I do believe. I see a hand back there. Oh, I can also walk this mic around. Okay.
Thank you. I have so many questions. I don't know where to start and where to finish. The first one is, when you spoke about Anne Frank, you spoke about or one of you did, about the universalation, if you can making her universal sort of symbol rather than the specificity. And this is something that's always puzzled me about the Shoah, how you retain the specificity and yet at the same time draw some of what we hope are universal messages. That's the first question. The second one is, you talk about looking at the Shoah through a prism of love or understanding it through a prism of love. And I find that very, very difficult, because that leads to my third point, which is that people are too frightened to look at it. I don't know whether it's a question of lack of love or being too frightened, or whether it's simply, and I'm 86 years old and I'm still struggling with this, whether it's simply an inability to comprehend that this could have happened, even though I know from my own experience that it did. So I'm sorry, I've wrapped up quite a few themes, but I could go on asking 10 or 15 more questions.
Hello. Thank you so much for your question. I hope I won't gabble in answer. I only have a few half-formed thoughts of this, which is, I think Anne Frank became a universal symbol because it was just easier, and it's part of the theft that I've talked about. To retain the specificity of Anne Frank, you need to say again and again and again when teaching about her that she was murdered because she was a Jew. You know, that is the beginning and the end of her story, and stop extrapolating from it all these kinds of points that she's some kind of universal human rights warrior, and if she was alive, she'd be on the Gaza flotilla with Greta Thunberg heading to Israel to you know, to save the Palestinians. You know, you know, is there a universal message of the Holocaust? Of course there is. You know, and it's horrifyingly banal. And I've been told off by it, by other people I've been interviewed by, but luckily not Dan. And I mean, I remember when I went to Birkenau, and everybody will have their own view, but when I went to Birkenau, you know, the grass in the summer, it goes up to your waist, and it's so lush, and you can hear it move in the wind. And I saw this tiny Polish child running towards the memorial because, of course, 100,000 non-Jewish Poles were murdered there. So she was obviously being taken to visit a memorial site for a relative. And all I could think of was love people, just love people. And I think that's a biblical phrase, isn't it? Which is, you know, lovely the stranger, you know, for we were strangers in the land of Israel. But, you know, this, you know, when faced with what happened and what we're facing now, it sort of feels ridiculous. But as I say in the book, you cannot understand or even begin to think of a universal story, a universal message, as we must say most horribly, unless you first digested and understood the specific message, which is that it happened to Jews. And I see no real, you know, sign of that. Not Jews as we really are, fictional Jews, yes. Real Jews, no. Do people understand that it could have happened? I think you'll get a different answer depending on who you ask. I don't think the Jewish answer and the non-Jewish answer will necessarily be the same thing. I think we all know what happened. You know, we feel it. Of course, when I went to Auschwitz, I was stunned by the architecture and the trees, that there could be a tree in such a place, or there could be a roundabout in such a place. But I refuse to let people off the hook anymore, you know, with this. And again, that was a very rambling answer. And thank you very, very much for your question, and also for coming. I wanted to say how thrilled I was, you know, to be talking to an Australian community. I follow your news, you know, closely.
I have a question, but I want to thank you for two things. I mean, your essay and the fact that you eviscerated all these works that I've tried to convince a lot of people aren't worth reading, and now I have more evidence. And the other thing is, someone gave us a copy of Sophie's Choice some years ago, and I've had it on the shelf for many years thinking, why don't I read that book? Now I know why I'm not going to read the book, and I thank you for that. But my question is, I know there are many books and films that, you know, you could have discussed, but there's two in particular, one, I suppose, of each side, good and bad. One is The Grey Zone. Do you know that film, the American film? Harvey Keitel plays the Nazi.
Yeah.
And the other film is, of course, Life is Beautiful, which had a lot of publicity here with people saying, yes, it made me feel empathetic, it was great, and other people saying, you know, it's ridiculous to have a comedy about the Holocaust. So I'm just wondering what your comments are about those two in particular, and perhaps why you didn't mention The Grey Zone, because I tend to think it does fit in with some of those positive ones you mentioned.
I need to apologise to you and say I didn't read I mean, I didn't watch the Grey Zone. I just got to a point. I'm so sorry. I just couldn't face it. And I felt, having watched Son of Saul, I didn't have to, but I didn't mention it, so I made no judgment on it. So I apologize for that omission. I did see Life is Beautiful, and I thought, with Life is Beautiful, as I thought, it's a great film, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with Holocaust. It's not a Holocaust film. It's a film about how much a father loves his son, and it should not have been set in the Holocaust, or pretended to be about the Holocaust. And I think I'm probably being too kind, because I couldn't hate it, because it was made with this crazy enthusiasm. But it's part of this trend. It's part of this trend for things that are not true, and they are things that are not true based on other things that are not true. As I said, it's fine to fictionalize something if you understand it, and if you then add to the knowledge of it. And then, of course, there's, within Life of Beautiful, this idea. I mean, the idea of a I mean, the whole premise of it was completely bogus, but I remember being disgusted, actually, because of course the thing is, it's a game. Life is Beautiful. A father is in a camp with his son, and he tells his son, we're going to win the game, and this is how we win the game. And at the end, the boy survives, and he says, we won, and I found that made me feel slightly sick. I mean, it's not serious culture. It's not serious. And I would tell people it's not serious. If I got problems with, Schindler's Ark and even Anne Frank's Diary, I'm not going to have a problem telling people not to watch Life is Beautiful. Tell them.
Anyone else have a question? Anyone else have a question before we wrap up? We can take one more, potentially.
I mean, I have a story if you need to fill the
No,
space.
we've got another question coming your way. Here it comes.
Firstly, thank you very much I haven't read your essay yet, and I look forward to reading it. My question is, if you were to give advice to someone who wants to make a Holocaust film, given everything you now know, what would be your advice? And particularly because it's become a subject that people still make films about and write books about. So now that you've done this research, I'm wondering what you would tell people to do.
Read everything. Do what Martin Amis did. Read everything. And when you've read everything and thought about everything and understood everything, then maybe you will make something, that is worthy. Because, what is good and bad culture is, it's a very, very subjective thing. But, you see all the times in this trash, just lies, just rubbish, and stop treating it as a starting point for your own sort of absurd ideas about what the Holocaust is or isn't. Basically, just put Jews back into it, is what I would say. Though, as you alluded to earlier, Dan, some of these, there's a terrible Jewish writer called Ellie Midwood who writes pulp fiction about the Holocaust. She writes romances set in Auschwitz, but perhaps she's processing, stuff for herself. But yeah, I would say understand it first. And you can understand it. You just, like everything, you have to try.
Oh, we do have another question that popped up, actually.
Thank you, Tanya. This is not a question so much to you as to this audience here. Recently, I was talking to a school here, and I was warned by one of the staff that the school had been reading a book in the Holocaust education program called Eating Chocolate Cake with Hitler. And this is a book about the daughter of Joseph Goebbels eating chocolate cake with Hitler in the bunker. So if you think you've heard the worst of the Holocaust books, I think this must be it. I have not read it.
Thank you. I will check it out. Yeah.
I don't know if that was a recommendation or not. Was that a...
Definitely a recommendation for me, and I will definitely look at it.
Yeah.
Because it's my job to police all this stuff.
Well, thank you. I think we will. Is the story that you thought of burning? Because it'd be a great way for us to close, perhaps the story.
Oh, yeah,
that
well,
you-
it might cheer you up. So I was writing a piece for the Jewish Chronicle, the UK's Jewish newspaper, based on my essay, and I was sitting in a swimming pool. I live in West Cornwall. There's a massive sea, and there's a pool, and there's a lovely cafe. And I was sitting in the cafe typing this work out, and then next to me there was a woman, and she was reading a book called The Violence of Auschwitz. You know, clearly, affluent bourgeois socialist. Clearly, I can spot these people 10 miles out in the dark. And I said, "Oh, that looks interesting." And she went, "Mm." And I said, "Oh, have you heard of Primo Levi?" And I was just having fun now. Zamgodowski, Borowski, what did you think of the zone of interest? She got really, really cross with me very, very quickly. I mean, she didn't like shouting at me, and I was just being facetious because I just thought, oh my God, this is how you're choosing to spend your beautiful summer's day, is you're dipping a toe into the Holocaust like a woman going on a roller coaster to experience fear at a safe distance. And you may think I'm unfair to extrapolate all this, but this is my job. Sometimes I know people better than they know themselves, especially if they're bourgeois British socialists. And I sort of told you that story to sort of to cheer you up a bit. But again, it's impersonation and it's theft. So I think I ruined her day. And then my son came along, it was his birthday, and demanded his chocolate cake, and we all sang happy birthday, and she didn't sing along. So there we go.
Well, I don't know if you can hear the laughter around me, but everybody appreciated that story. Thank you very much for it, and keep fighting the good fight, I'd say, on behalf of all of us here. I'll turn it over to Bree now, who will close us out. But thank you so much, Tanya. We really appreciate you spending some time with us here.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to everyone who listened, and God bless you.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for joining us. You can't tell, but you're literally larger than life in the room for us now. So
like
thank
a
you
big
so much
head.
for joining us. You are. And also, I don't think I've been to a talk about the Holocaust with quite so much laughter. So well done. Also, just wanted to thank Dan, our wonderful moderator for this evening.
Thanks,
I'm very
Dan.
glad we roped you in for moderating for us this evening, and I think you're going to be doing it a lot more for us. So thank you. Also to our partners, Melbourne Jewish Book Week, we love working with you every year, and thank you for bringing this event to the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. Before I let you all leave, if you did find this talk really interesting tonight, we have one coming up on the 19th of November, which I think will be very, very interesting. So Australian journalist Mark Ahrens, he produced, some of you might be familiar, a radio documentary series in 1986 that has exposed the number of Nazi war criminals in Australia. And this led to a parliamentary inquiry that created the first Australian Special Investigations Unit. We're going to be having here on the 19th of December, Mark Ahrens. November, thank you. I'm going on holiday next week. I clearly need it. We're going to be having Mark Ahrens together with Conrad Queet, Professor Conrad Queet, who is the chief historian on that Special Investigations Unit, and Graham Blewett here at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. I think the three of them in conversation is going to be absolutely phenomenal. And that's actually in promotion of their new book called Nazis in Australia, which is being published by Schwartz Books. So I think that sounds like one many of you might be interested in the room. If you would like to purchase a copy of Shameless, we have our wonderful team over here. And of course, I'm wishing you all a Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Good night.
Thank you.